Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Presumably, since no one is responding. Anyway, this talk is going to be about going to the conference for the last 10 years or so, essentially knowing nothing about monitoring to going to knowing nothing about monitoring. So it's sort of my journey from one to the other. And as always, any questions or anything, feel free to chime in, though for reasons which will later be apparent, you won't. But let's get started. So I usually title myself as an architect, not because I am an architect, but because I've noticed that old people are architects, and I've started to get old. It's horrible, but it actually happens. Now, what I love to do is build things. I love the concept of building, creating, going from nothing to something with just your hands and your imagination. It's that magical feeling when you can see that there was nothing here until suddenly there is something there, right? That's what I get off on. I don't really care for the whole, drawing things, but I do like to point my finger sometimes, so that's a good thing. Anyway, this is usually how I look when I'm not building things. This is me skiing for the first and almost last time in my life. I also have 2 girls at home who are essentially useless. Thus far, in the last 8 years, they have committed 0 lines of code. I was thinking, Ennis Client, as a 3-team guy is going to be awesome, but no, it's just, me instead taking care of them. Yeah, don't get kids is what I'm saying. But at least nowadays, when I'm not building something, I am slightly happier because I can go skiing again, because they bothered me into it. But that's not why we're here, right? Because we're going to talk about Ennis Client. And actually, we're not going to talk about Ennis Client this year. And I don't always talk about Ennis Client, it's just frequently. A couple of years back, I did application monitoring, trying to get people to stop monitoring hardware and instead monitoring applications. And then I did Why We Do Monitoring Wrong, trying to get people to stop monitoring hardware and instead start monitoring applications. And this year, I'm essentially doing the opposite because I'm doing a talk where I'm trying to get people to stop monitoring applications and start monitoring hardware instead. So we'll see how that turns out. The original title for this talk was The Cynical History of Monitoring, but I felt it was a bit too depressing, so I changed it into 10 years of OSMC because it sounded slightly more happy, right? And the original byline was really, how Netflix ruined monitoring and everything else. And I want to be clear, I don't hate Stranger Things. I love Stranger Things. But there's one other guy who also loves Stranger Things. But the problem here is that they do 8 episodes, which I watch in one day, and then there's nothing for 365 days. And then there's 8 more episodes, and then there's nothing for like 400, 500, 600 days. And this far, there's still nothing. So I'm getting, I need my fix. I need, a constant flow. We have a contract, 26 episodes, 1 every week across the year. Not nothing for years and years. But anyway, I'm digressing. What I'm talking about is going to the Open Source Monitoring Conference 10 years ago. And this was the first time for me going to Nuremberg. I don't know anything about Nuremberg. Well, not correct. I know 2 things about Nuremberg. The first one apparently was a lie, because this is not in Nuremberg. Yeah. The other thing you tend to know about Nuremberg is obviously the really seriously space shit headphones they had back in the 40s. But for me, what I always remember is that I was scared to death because I'm a developer. I don't do monitoring. I don't know anything about monitoring. I've never worked with monitoring. I develop stuff, and then I eventually end up having to run them, which means that I need to monitor them, right? But it's always been a side gig for me. And when you're going to do a talk in front of people who are presumably working with monitoring, when you don't know anything about monitoring, you have this fear that someone will eventually, raise their hand and go, "Hey, Michael, you're completely wrong." And I'll be like, "Yeah, I know. I don't know this stuff. You guys do." And for me, that's always been the greatest fear, right? That someone is going to call my ruse, right, and tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. And that's the one thing I've learned from going to this conference that no one ever does, I can go up here and say whatever crazy shit I want, and you'll just be like, "Awesome." This guy knows way more than me because I have no idea what he's talking about. So essentially what I'm doing is a trump, I'm just lying, I'm just gonna, come up with bullshit stuff from the top of my head that has no sense or bearing whatsoever. But it works, and that's the cool thing about it. But anyway, I'm digressing. 10 years ago, when I came to this conference, I had this little guy with me. It's a Sony Ericsson W910i. And for the youngsters in the room, 10 years ago, phones came in different form factors. You had like slider phones, you had like flip phones, and you have all sorts of weird phones, not just what we have today, which is the broken glass phone, right? I don't really know why, but all the hipsters have them. I myself tend to try to not do the broken glass edition. But the interesting thing is that when I was researching, that sounds grand, right? When I was preparing slides for this talk, which essentially is Google image search, I found this. So the slider phone is back, And I'm totally getting it once it hits Europe. Apparently it's a Chinese phone, right? So they're way ahead of us. But if you compare my phone now to my phone back then, there is a slight difference because this one is way larger. Back in the days, they tried to make smaller things. Nowadays, it's going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. But my phone had about 40 megabytes of RAM, which is, pretty much what one application is using nowadays. It technically had internet, and it had a Walkman, which was like the 10-year ago MP3 player thingy, right? But of course, that didn't really work, so I also had a real MP3 player with me. And the interesting thing about this MP3 player is that it had the dongle. You can see it up here, right? So 10 years ago, way before Apple invented the dongle, I had it. I had the dongle first, right? And the interesting thing is that the dongle goes the other way. So you plug it into the headphone jack, and out comes a USB port. But, it's the exact same thing, right? And of course, because I'm a gadget freak, I had my tablet with me. This is what tablet looked back then. And once you held this in your hand, you could almost feel like this was Star Trek, right? You walked around with it, and you could swiping and things didn't work, so you had to click, yeah. But still, and you had to use the keyboard most of the time, but still it felt like Star Trek, right? And I've always loved technology and, the stuff that we will eventually get, right? And for me, Star Trek was never about aliens and stories and things like that. It was always about the gadgets. When Picard enters the room and goes, like tea, Earl Grey, hot. It's the reason why I drink tea, why I don't drink coffee. Because I want to say that to my tea maker. And all of these things, like telling them to turn on the lights and, talking to your computer. All of this stuff has always been what I enjoy and what I like. And 10 years ago, I wired some cables to my door so that when I opened the door, the lights turned on. I, of course, electrocuted myself in the process, but still, it was cool, right? You could feel that, this is the future. And then this comes along, and I go like, wow, I don't want to talk to my computer. I want to go like this, kung fu, And now I have a touch computer, and you realize that it's just like kung fu, that sitting like this for hours and hours means that you need strength in your arms, which I don't possess. So I never used a touch computer. And a lot of these modern technology, if you will, tends out to be like that. It looks awesome on paper, and then once you actually get it, you realize that, not really my thing. But still, you really want to be cool, right? And you want to have all this future technology. Which is why I have an entire room full with, useless stuff that I bought throughout the years at home. The reason why I'm telling you this is because we are living in a world of magic. 10 years ago, all the stuff that I imagined the future would hold, I pretty much have today. All of the stuff that 10 years ago was science fiction has turned into reality. So we are living in this magical world where, I can actually talk to my computer. It's not science fiction anymore. When I get home, I say, hey, Google, unlock my door, and it unlocks my door. Now this is idiotic because my neighbors can do the same thing and the thieves can do the same thing, but I don't care because it's awesome. The feeling that, my voice controls the lock to my door is enough for me to have this feature. And of course, I can, tell it to turn on the lights. I can tell it to turn on, the television and all that stuff. 10 years ago, I bought a special headset. I had Dragon Dictate in my computer, and I spent hours and hours trying to teach it my voice. And the way you did it was essentially teaching it your voice. So you sat there going like, dog, dog, dog. And then you have to go to the next one. So cat, cat, cat. And you spent hours and hours just repeating these words. And still, you could barely use it to start things and use it for commands, right? A couple of weeks ago, my Google Home started to speak Swedish. I just woke up one morning and say, hey Google, vad är klockan? And it responded back to me in Swedish. I didn't train it, I didn't update it, I didn't do anything. It just magically went from speaking English to speaking English and Swedish. And this is magical, right? And I mean, if we talk about computing power, this phone that I have today is more powerful than my laptop 10 years ago in every possible way. The screen is better, the camera is, I don't even think my laptop had a camera, but the battery is better, the CPU is better, everything is better, right? So in this 10 years, we've gone from science fiction to reality. And this almost gonna happen, right? Nowadays when you plug something into a Linux computer, it almost always works. It's just rarely that you have to download some weird driver somewhere and configure something. Most of the times it just works out of the box, right? And of course, 2 weeks ago they launched self-driving buses in Sweden. First in Europe, or so they tell me. And the first thing that you strike you when you go with this is that they're not self-driving, because there's a driver in them. And whenever it hits something, it doesn't expect, like someone parking a bike next to the road, it just stops and goes beep, 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 beep. And then the driver has to go and drive around the drive around the bike, and then the bus can continue, right? And if you actually look at it, it's not even a bus either, right? It's just a weird yellow painted car, right, with bus doors. So even that is sad, right? But still, this is self-driving cars on the streets in Sweden, ish, right? And we even have flying cars. Now, when I imagined flying cars, I was imagining something slightly more practical. But kudos for making it a bloody convertible car in space. That's way more ambitious than having, like, say, a flying car on the ground, which you could actually use, right? And it's not just technology that's changed in these 10 years. I mean, 10 years ago, when I wanted to watch a movie, I had to import it from the US. Then I realized that my DVD player couldn't play it because of regional encodings. So I had to download it on Pirate Bay. And then I realized that the format was wrong, so I had to convert it to some other format and then copy it off to my big, chunky computer that was connected to my television. And all of this took a lot of time. And nowadays, I can just watch things on Netflix with a click of a button, right? And then I realized that the show is not on Netflix, so I have to get an HBO subscription. And then you quickly realize that it's not on HBO either, so you have to get another subscription, and eventually you have all of the subscription, right? So we've changed how we consume things, right? And if we look at monitoring 10 years ago, what were we doing? Well, we were configuring thresholds, we were configuring bounds, we were setting up alerts. And if I look at monitoring today, what I'm doing is essentially configuring bounds, setting thresholds, setting up alerts. So while some things have gone from science fiction to reality, monitoring seems to have gone from over there to over there. We haven't had this drastic change that we've had in the rest of, or I wouldn't say the rest, but in many parts of the industry. We haven't gone from science fiction to reality. We are not living in a world of magic. We are living in the same world where we lived 10 years ago. And that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about here. So I've always had a soft spot for Nagios, mainly because their inept Windows support has allowed me to have my NS Client thing going for the past 10 years or so. But 10 years ago, Nagios was an old system. It was outdated. You sort of longed for the next version, right, when they were going to fix all the quirks and issues. So 10 years ago-ish, I was at a conference in Sweden where Ethan was giving a keynote. And of course, after the keynote, Ethan was at the Q&A session. And the first question he was asked was, what's the next big thing for Nagios? What's going to happen in the next 24 months? And of course, he goes like, I'm never going to give you up. I'm never going to let you down. No, he took it in a slightly different direction, because what he said was that Nagios is feature complete. And that was a huge blow to my stomach, because all of the stuff, I wanted, I realized was never going to happen. And this was really sad. And for me, this is when Nagios died. The exact date and demise of Nagios can be debated. But ultimately, this is when I started to see the cracks. This is when I started to see that Nagios was not the future. And of course, you could see that the community was starting to fracture. You could see that all of the problems that Nagios had was being solved elsewhere. We had Modgerman for the scalability issues. We had Adagios and Thruck for the web interface inaptness. We had MK Live Status and a whole bunch of these add-ons where you duct tape things onto Nagios to be able to use it in the next generation. But all of these things should really have gone into Nagios. But the problem here was that things weren't going into Nagios. There was no roadmap. There was no next version, because Nagios was feature complete, right? And for me, this was always, when things went, from awesome to not so awesome. Of course, this is when we had all the forks, right? And, the Isinga one is obviously the most famous, but Schinken was probably the first one, right? And when Sean Gabs came around and said, hey, we're going to rewrite Nagios in Python, it's going to be more performant, I was like, seriously, dude, are you stupid? That's the dumbest idea ever. How could rewriting something in another language make it better? And Python, seriously, that's like the worst language ever. And the sad thing is that he was right and I was wrong. It's not about the language, it's about the vision, the thriving community, there's a next version, there's going to be new things coming. That's what is important. The language doesn't matter. And I mean, Schinken is still around. Nagios technically is also still around, but it's not happening much, right? And then we obviously had the Isinga one, which was the bloody fork. We had Niemann when Andreas Ericsson tried to sort of do something with Nagios, which ultimately, I wouldn't say failed, but it didn't become the next big Nagios. But for me, Nagios really died when he was doing that Q&A session, when he said Nagios is feature complete. But the irony here is that Nagios is not dead, because every single company you go to, they still use Nagios in some form or shape. You can go to like one of those hipster unicorn companies, and they're using Nagios. And I go like, why? And they're like, yeah, it works. And that's really the irony here, because Nagios could have been really awesome if we hadn't given up on it. So why was Nagios so awesome, 10 years ago? Why was it awesome? Because as I said, the UI was crappy, it had a lot of issues, configuration files that, was difficult to parse, difficult to update, difficult to maintain, right? You couldn't reload the configuration without restarting things. No UI for updating things, so you had to use the configuration files and all of this clunky stuff. But on the other side, you had all this cool stuff, right? It worked, it did its job, it monitored pretty much everything you had. And if it didn't monitor whatever you had, you could always write a script for it. And it was the de facto standard, so there were like thousands of plugins, or well, I don't know, I haven't counted them, but there were many plugins. And also it had this 3D view you could open up, and people would go like, wow, that's awesome, I want it. I don't need it for anything, I just want it because it's awesome. But if you open up the box and you look inside, essentially what you have is cron. I mean, every 5 minutes we go out and run a script. If that script returns something else than 0, we send an email. That's pretty much Nagios, right? I mean, you could do this with 30 lines of shell script and some duct tape. But still, it works, right? Of course, the core feature of Nagios is a check. Even if you just want to graph, the performance metrics or the something, you still need to run a check, right? So there were a lot of these where you checked something and you set it down to like 4 billion because you just wanted to have the graph and you didn't want to get an alert. Of course, the graphs were always kind of tucked on at the side because there were no support for graphs in Nagios. You just had the performance data which you could log off somewhere and then someone else did the graphing, right? But still, you had graphs. And of course, for the hipsters, you had support for SNMP, JMX, WMI, and all this other stuff as well. And people went like, ugh, we don't want that. We want scripts. They're awesome. Because checks are awesome, right? checks are simple, checks are easy. You can read a script, you can understand it, you can reason about it, you can run it locally to figure out what it does, you can modify it. It's easy to work with checks. And once you actually have something that you're doing, you can just put it into Nagios and it's happening automatically. So it's very easy to going from, I want to monitor this, to something that actually works. But the big problem here is not writing the script. The big problem here is figuring out how and when something is broken. Because somehow you need to understand that this thing you have, how do I know when it's broken? And obviously, if it's something you have written, you know that. But when you just got some stuff thrown across the fence, you'll be like, I have no clue what this is. So the first thing you do is obviously go to Google. And then you Google for Oracle database, how do I monitor it, or something like that. And you find 25 different scripts that sounds like they kind of do the same thing. And then you download a couple of them and you start them out and you realize you need to install some drivers and then you need to have some SA password and you have no idea what that is. And you go to your DBA and he's like, no, you're not getting the SA password. And you say, but I need it for monitoring. He's like, you're not getting it. So you get your boss to ask and then finally you get the password. And then you run the command and you can connect and you're like, so how am I going to monitor this thing? I have no clue what a tablespace is. It's just something. Do I need to monitor it? I don't know. A lot of people, they monitor the table spaces, but most people have them set to auto-extend. So essentially what you're monitoring is that Oracle does not have a bug in the auto-extension feature of their database, which is a good thing because there are bugs in the Oracle database, but just not maybe the best place to monitor them. But this understanding you need to do some monitoring is actually the difficult part, right? It's not tacking some scripts together, it's knowing how to monitor something that's difficult. And that is difficult. That's not going to go away because you can download scripts or because you get your monitoring solution rewritten in Python. The monitoring thing is still the difficulty. Now if we sort of flip this around and go 10 years into the future, what we have is this, graphs overlaid on maps, graphs overlaid on graphs, graphs overlaid on graphs, which are overlaid on other graphs, which are overlaid on color-coded boxes, right? It's awesome. And it's in dark mode, so it's awesome. I even have my dark mode shirt on, so you're going to know that I'm awesome, right? And that's what we have nowadays. Dark mode UI, we have pretty graphs, and it looks really, really professional. But underneath it, what we really have are weird config files. You have to restart the agent to change the configuration. There is no web UI to edit this configuration. But you can always sort of work around this by saying that, no, but I don't want to edit my configuration in the UI anyway because I want to have it in Git. Yeah, maybe not the password bit, but the other bits. But still, it's always the same, right? Because we had the same problem with Nagios and we solved them the same way, right? But if you look at a lot of these modern tools, you get things like this. And it's super awesome because people go like, wow, I want to have that. I don't need it for anything. I just want to have it because it's cool, right? But ultimately, they work, they collect metrics, and you can do things with them, right? And if we sort of open up the box of the modern tools, we will find essentially cron. Every 5 minutes, second it is nowadays, they go out and scrape some HTTP endpoint, fetch some data. If the data are bigger or smaller than a certain number, we send off an email. You could do this with, shell script in curl in 10 minutes, right? So ultimately, we haven't changed that much, right? And we know that metrics is the core feature of these new tools. It's the first-class citizen, if you will. And of course, we know that metrics are awesome because they never lie, and graphs are awesome. But ultimately, graphs and metrics are not going to wake you up at 4 o'clock in the morning, so we need some sort of alerting. And then you end up with this alerting thing that's just tacked on at the end, where you have that weird syntax, and you can maybe figure out how to get the alert. And it's kind of clunky, but it works, it's there, and you can use it. Now, the reason why we switched to metrics from checks is because it's easy to understand metrics. You can just do curl on an endpoint, and you get a whole bunch of numbers. And it's easy to understand because it's a number, right? And you have a description. You can even get some help text in there if you want. So all of this is super awesome, and it's easy for developers to add new metrics. It's easy to understand them, to reason about them. But the real problem is not getting a metric in or out. The real problem is really figuring out which metrics to monitor and why. Because ultimately, if you go and look at your metrics, you will have thousands of them. And knowing which metrics to use for what purposes and when is really the difficult thing here, right? So what you do then when you end up in this scenario, well, you go to Google, because Google has all the answers for you. And you Google, how do I monitor something? And what you will usually end up on is, Google's golden signals, or, the use method, or the red method, or, whatever bullshit acronym they came up with. But essentially what they're telling you is, if you monitor the latency, the error rates and the traffic and that kind of stuff of your HTTP endpoint, everything is fine. And then you're thinking, yeah, but I don't have an HTTP service. I'm going to monitor my mail server. And they go like, yeah, well, there's probably a similar metric you can use. You can always look at the list, right? And that's really the problem, finding out which metrics to use. And of course, someone will eventually go ask yourself, what does this number actually mean? And you'll be like, yeah, it's like the requests per sec. Maybe it's Billy's, yeah, it's something, request something. and they go, well, yeah, but I have 25 here, why do you have 36? Yeah, because my system is better than yours. and understanding what all of these metrics are is difficult unless you're written the software yourself, right, which you usually haven't. And then once you've sort of glanced off the fact that you have no clue what you're monitoring, you end up with the fact that mathematics are actually not simple, because averages are not always what you expect them to be. But the good thing here is that you usually start out with average response time, and then you have like 5 servers, so you take the average of the average response time, and then you put that in a graph, which means that you're essentially displaying the average of the average of the average. And for those of you who don't follow this, mathematically, an average of an average is absolutely nothing. It's like saying, I have 4 cars and 2 sodas. What's the average of that? And mathematically, you will absolutely get a value, but it will have no meaning. There will be no sense to this, because you can't do an average of an average mathematically. So what you usually end up with in all of these graphs is essentially nonsense. It's nonsense that has some sort of bearing and some sort of meaning to your system, because when the nonsense changes from this to this, you know that something has changed, right? But the values in themselves have no bearing, they have no meaning, and you can't really make sense from them. So it's very difficult to say that, when this value goes about this threshold, that means something, because the value itself doesn't mean anything. And once you've sort of realized that the fact that that the average response time is good doesn't help the guy drowning, you can sort of get into the next hurdle, and that's the fact that you don't have one system you're going to monitor, because you usually have a load balancer, you have an ingress proxy, you have an HTTP server, you have an application, you have some middleware, you have a database. And then you realize the fact that the only way we can monitor all these together is if we have some sort of dimensional structure. If we say that the name here means something all the way to here. And then you need to sit down and sort of come up with some way to figure out how you're going to structure all your dimensions across all your infrastructure. And that's also kind of difficult, because you have usually some sort of cloud infrastructure nowadays that says that this is the way we call the metric, these are our dimensions. And then you have some custom infrastructure that maybe doesn't adhere to those rules. And then you end up somewhere here, right? Where you've gone from it's really difficult to do monitoring with scripts to it's really difficult to do monitoring with metrics. And we haven't really solved the problems, right? When the other things, went 10 years into the future, would become awesome, right? Monitoring just went from checks to metrics. We went from one language to another. And the reason why this is because of this. And this is why I blame Netflix. And it's not Netflix per se, it's that all of these DevOps guys wanted monitoring. And they came along and they said, hey, we're going to do DevOps, we're going to do monitoring our way. We don't want to have Nagios, we want to have our monitoring tools. We want to have our ways. And, I'm not saying ultimately that they're wrong. I mean, the new tools are fine and they work really well, right? But they just reinvented everything. They took Nagios and they rewrote it in their language, right? And that's not necessarily Netflix's fault or Uber's fault or some other hipster company. It's the fact that Nagios died and there was no next version. So it's ultimately Nagios' own fault that Nagios demised. But the sad thing is that instead of building on top of what we had, we built something completely new on the side. So instead of flying cars, we got electric cars that looks like they can fly, right? And I'm not bashing electric cars. They're super awesome, but they're not flying cars. They don't solve the congestion problem because an electric car takes up the exact same space as a regular gasoline car. They don't solve the environmental problem because essentially we're moving off of gasoline to coal power, and that has, the same amount of fossil fuel release, right? So instead of, all of these awesome new monitoring solutions, we essentially got, awesome new monitoring solutions rewritten in Go, where, we had C++ and Python before. And if you look at monitoring, you'll see that it's very reflective of the era and the people who are building it. First, we had these guys who wanted monitoring, and they love standards. They probably have standards for doing their standards because half of them are called the same, right? But if there's anything they love except for standards, it's numbers and dots. It's like 802.11. There has to be a dot in it, right? So what monitoring do you think these guys come up with? Well, of course, it has a lot of numbers and dots in them, right? I mean, it's the only way it could be. And I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's very reflective of the people. And the tools were impossibly complicated. You needed to be certified to use them, just like you have to be certified to use a router, right? So all of this was sort of built up by the people who were needing the monitoring. And then these guys comes along. And, they spend their entire lives writing scripts, right? And, shoehorning things together and using a lot of duct tape. And the sysadmins, when they came along, their monitoring were based on scripts, right? Because that's how they work, and that's what they do, right? It's what's easy for them. And then if we look at, the next generation monitoring, we had these guys, who were building applications who came in and, wrote their monitoring. So, of course, their monitoring is going to be based on pretty graphs and nice UIs and cool dark themes, right? But it hasn't really changed how we do monitoring. Back in the SNMP days, we still had cron running every X minute, fetching data, checking it, and then comparing it to whatever it should be, and then we sent off an email. In Nagios, we have Nagios running scripts every X minute and sending off the email alert. And nowadays, we have Prometheus fetching metrics from REST endpoints every X minutes, sending off alerts, right? So it kind of works the same as it has for not the past 10 years, but more like the past 40 years or something like that. I have no clue when SNMP was invented, way before my time. It's too difficult for me. So what I'm saying is that, if we want the next generation monitoring to be the flying car and not just the car that looks like it can fly, we need to think about this differently. We need to, not rewrite it in some other fancy language. We need to actually think about the problems we're having and try to solve them. Monitoring is not about checks, it's not about metrics, and it's not even about logs. It's about all of them together, right? We need to use metrics, we need to use checks, and we need to use logs. And we also need to use things like events, or SNMP traps, as they were called back in the SNMP days. Because all of these together is what forms the vision of things like. And these tools shouldn't be, something you put a lot of duct tape around and, somehow get together, like a lot of, the enterprise package monitoring solution that just shoehorns in an elk stack because then they get logs as well. That's not really what we need. We need a solution that actually can look at all of these, right? And we also need a way to communicate with our monitoring tool so that we can figure out when we get this metric, what is the unit? Is it seconds or microseconds or milliseconds? We should be able to know this, right? The tools should be able to detect this. But more importantly, the tool should be able to say that, hey, we're monitoring things in milliseconds here. Can you give me this metric in milliseconds instead of seconds? And they should be able to do this without me configuring it. They should be able to do this by talking, by communicating, right? And then we have the things like we're sending averages everywhere because it's easy. We should send histograms everywhere because that's truth, or that's more truth than averages. But to do that, then we need to have this communication in place because histograms require some sort of upfront configuration. So the monitoring tools need to be able to tell the client that, hey, I want to have the histograms with this bucket size because that's what node 2, 3, and 4 is sending me. You shouldn't have to configure all this by yourself, and you should be able to take the average response time of your 5 server cluster. It shouldn't be something you have to do by hand or just, let's hope the averages are kind of the same, as long as the load balancer is equal, right? And then, of course, all of these metric names, we need some sort of standard to get them to be together, right? So I know what this metric means. A way to move my dashboard from one system to the other. A way that I can share this dashboard with other people without having to tell them, grab some metrics and put them yourself in the dashboard. But nowadays, when you have, going from one team to another, their naming schemes for their metrics is completely different. When you're moving from one cloud provider to another, all the metrics will be renamed, right? There's no way to build a solution that works in all these settings, except hand-tailoring to all these settings. And of course, in the SNMP world, we had the OID naming schemes, right? So essentially, what I'm trying to tell you here is that the monitoring solution of the future is SNMP. Because that ticks all the boxes, right? And before I'm lynched, I'm essentially going to say thank you for listening. Then that was all I had. Yeah.
So we have still some time for questions. What questions can Michael answer for you? Anyone?
Oh, really? You didn't get the whole Trump
maybe
thing?
You can just repeat
it's just going to be fake media if it's a bad question.
Yeah.
When will you implement an SNMP agent in NS Client++ so we get rid of this?
Funny you ask that. Have you looked at the latest version? No. Hopefully never, but you never know. Any other questions?
Yeah, just as a quick reference, is NS Client feature complete?
No. It never will be.
So, anyone else? Michael, what is the next big thing for NS Client?
Yeah, I know it's feature. No. Well, I was kind of asked that question a while back, as in a couple of minutes back, and I started to build a new web interface in Angular 2, it was at the time. Now it's 8.25, I don't know, version changes quickly. And unfortunately, Angular is like the worst thing ever. So I've spent hours, no, it's like weeks and weeks and weeks trying to get this web interface to actually work. And I've failed thus far. So once that's done, then I'm going to focus on two things, essentially. It's going to be Docker support and Prometheus. So that's pretty much the next two things on the agenda.
All right. Michael, thank you very much for being here. It's always great to have you here.
Thank you.
We have a small present for you.
Is it?
Maybe.
Thank you.